consciousness-centric model based on Simondon, which views external reality as a symbolic interface for alternate inner states of being. So that looks like a word salad. We'll decompress that as we go along. So first, a little bit of background. So I'm a PhD candidate. My topic is on overcoming alienation through governance in centralized and decentralized metaverse spaces, based on Simondon's philosophy. I'm a third-year PhD student, and you might wonder what the link is with consciousness in first person. And reading Simondon basically has sparked a lot of interest in more ontological and fundamental questions about the nature of reality and consciousness, the existence of individuals in this reality. And so I wanted to explore these questions further, and so see what the implications would be on conceptualizing our relationship to technologies such as a metaverse, which can be influenced by those kinds of ontologies. So ontology is always kind of risky, but it's arguably where progress is made, because ontology has the power of reframing the same experience and give it radically different meaning. So for instance, you talk about gravity. If you look at the way Aristotle explained it, it was a teleological kind of phenomenon where an object seeked an end state, which was being on the ground. And then Newton came up with gravity, and that completely reframed what looked like the same experience. In other words, the facts that events observed acquire certain meaning, notably through an ontological framework, and if we're not careful, then the experience we conduct can be based on internalized and unquestioned ontology. And so in this presentation, I'll explore an original ontological framework based on Simondon's philosophy of individuation. So Simondon's philosophy of individuation ties in nicely with first-person experience, since first-person experience presupposes the existence of individuals. The problem Simondon tries to tackle is how something that is not yet an individual becomes an individual, or the transition from a kind of a transcendental, formless state, which isn't an individual, to an individual. Simondon critiques two different approaches to this question: the substantialist one and the hylomorphic one. Substantialism presupposes ready-made, kind of self-enclosed substances, and so it skips the whole genesis part of individuation. And hylomorphism says that inert matter is impressed with a certain form, but doesn't say anything about where the form comes from or the ordering power of the form. So in this case, Simondon gives the example of the clay and the mold. So whereby, in order to have a brick, you need to have the raw material, the substance, and the mold, which is the form, and then also the brick maker, which impresses on the clay. But then, what's the genesis of the mold, and where does the raw material come from, and where does the brick maker come from as well? And so, we can't have this kind of hylomorphic understanding of reality. So Simondon's core idea is to propose the concept of the pre-individual state, which is a metastable field full of potential, but without any kind of structure. To structure this metastable field, there needs to be the introduction of what he calls a singularity, or a seed, around which this structuring can take place. So Simondon gives the example of the phenomenon of crystallization in his work. If you insert a seed into a supersaturated solution, the surrounding molecules begin to organize themselves around it, forming a crystal. This process is not determined by an external form, or is an imposed structure, but it is an internal dynamic within the metastable system itself. The system possesses kind of tensions and potentialities within that solution that seek resolution, and the seed serves as a catalyst for the system's self-organization. This process is what Simondon calls transduction. So transduction is the operation by which a new structure propagates through a medium, resolving internal tensions by establishing a new mode of organization. So Simondon favors process over result, and also metastability over stability or change, that kind of duality. So transduction then is the propagation of the resolution of tensions between individuals and the milieu, drawing on the pre-individual potential. And the individuation output is therefore the individual and his associated milieu, never one without the other. Now that's a really key idea. This core idea for this presentation is the simultaneous co-emergence of the individual and his associated milieu, or environment, you could say, or the context within which the individual appears. And here are a few direct quotes from Simondon to illustrate that idea. What individuation manifests is not merely the individual, but the individual-milieu coupling. Now he gives the example of a stone. A stone broken in two halves produces a pair of symbols. Each fragment can be brought together within its complementary piece in a way so as to reconstitute the initial unity of the broken stone. Each half is a symbol relative to the other. So in other words, the milieu is a symbol relative to the individual and vice versa, right? They're together. They're really fused together like two halves of broken stone. So if we follow Simondon's claim, then the first individual, in order to qualify as an individual, has to have an interiority and an exteriority, or a boundary between an inner reality and an outer reality. But mainstream science tells us that the best way to think of matter is through fields. That is, which means that everything is connected, even in very tenuous ways, to everything else, and you can't draw a boundary between an inside and an outside. Life is arguably the only structure which has this distinction, which Simondon also underlines in this passage. The physical individual, perpetually decentered, perpetually peripheral relative to itself, active at the boundary of its domain, lacks true interiority. By contrast, the living individual possesses genuine interiority because individuation occurs within. In the living individual, the interior is also constitutive, whereas in the physical individual, only the boundary is constitutive, and what is topologically interior is genetically prior. The living individual is contemporary with itself in all its elements, unlike the physical individual, which contains elements that are radically past, even when it is still growing. The living being is internally a node of informational communication. It is a system within a system embodying in itself the mediation between two orders of magnitude. Now, this idea of the mediation between two orders of magnitude, the inner micro dimension and the outer macro dimension, will also be a key idea for this presentation. So, if life began billions of years ago, after the Big Bang, then what was the first individual? And how could we imagine the universe and the individual co-emerging from the start, based on Simondon's philosophy, which is incompatible with that kind of view? So the first idea I will leverage as a key ingredient to the emergence of individuals is the phenomenon of dissociation in consciousness. So dissociation is a well-known phenomenon in psychology and psychiatry, whereby a single person can have multiple personalities that are not aware of one another, sometimes going as far as having specific ailments or health issues that the other personality doesn't have, but in the same body, which is really strange. And so from an idealist perspective, like that of Bernardo Kastrup, in order to explain how individuals can have discrete conscious experiences within a fundamentally unified field of consciousness, it presupposes a dissociation within this consciousness. And so the assumption that I make tying dissociation with individuation is that a dissociated consciousness is kind of the singularity or the seed which initiates the individuation process from the pre-individual state, either to experience as extensively as possible its own essence as a dissociated consciousness via the play with form, or to ultimately overcome dissociation by exhausting the experiential potential within its mind's eye through creating and experiencing dissociation in form, and then gradually unraveling the limitations it placed upon itself and reverting back to its original unified state. I also like to revisit Putnam's brain in a vat thought experiment, which I kind of twist a little bit. It's not about finding out whether reality is real or is a simulation, but just to wonder if you were a brain in a vat without any stimuli, with no computer feeding you information, what would be your state? What would be your what would happen? How would you perceive external reality? What would be the current neural arrangement in your brain, right? In that kind of state, you wouldn't know how you should feel, what you're supposed to do. You'd probably have just this feeling of existing, but not knowing as what or what to do, this boundless blackness that you'd be in. But what you could do, though, is you could imagine a virtual reality that doesn't exist, it's in your mind's eye, to give you an objective reason to shift your inner state in certain specific ways. Otherwise, you have no reason to do anything, right? And so, in other words, the main problem of consciousness faces is how to create limitations for itself in order to give itself an objective reason to, quote-unquote, think of one experience rather than another. And also to overcome instantaneity and create a time lag between its initial will and the experience of that will. So, if I ask you to close your eyes now and imagine a pink giraffe in your mind, it'll probably happen instantly. There wouldn't be no time lag where you'd have to think hard and assemble parts. But if I ask you to experience it in reality, you'd have to walk out of here, go and buy some pink paint, go to the zoo, climb into the giraffe's den, paint the giraffe pink, right? There's a lot of steps involved in that, and you can't skip them. What's marvelous is the moment I asked you to imagine that pink giraffe, there was no lag to change your mind. You couldn't say, oh, well, actually, I'm going to imagine it green. But if you go to the store, you could change your mind there. You could decide, well, you know what? I'm going to paint it green. I don't like pink. So you can kind of view life as a kind of course structure enabling the slowing down of thought to the point where you can experience its granular unraveling and also modify it as it is unfolding, which is quite magical if you think about it. So now we can revisit the idea of the individual-milieu coupling. The puzzle of the very first individual extends to the emergence of the milieu and what the milieu would look like from the perspective of the very first individual. Here I'll leverage the work of Niklas Luhmann, a systems thinker who examined the relationship between actuality and potentiality, which can be related to Simondon's individuation process and the milieu-individual coupling. Luhmann argues that every actualization, like something becoming real or concrete, simultaneously virtualizes all the other possibilities that didn't happen at that moment but are related to that actualization. So these other possibilities remain present as potential future choices. Thus, every moment of actualization is followed by another selection amongst possibilities. Meaning continuously reconfigures itself through time, moving forward by always choosing from the horizon of possibilities. In other words, the associated milieu to an individual is all that the individual could have been, but isn't at the moment of actualization. Based on his current state or his current inner structuring. But this raises a kind of a further issue. What is the actualized state of the very first individual? Why would it be in a specific state rather than another upon emergence? And here Simondon is helpful as he stresses the importance of relationships and properties. Here's quoting Simondon. The veritable properties of the individual are at the level of its genesis and, for this very reason, at the level of its relation with other beings. Since, if the individual is the being that is always capable of continuing its genesis, this genetic dynamism resides in its relation to other beings. Or another quote that is also very important. A being totally symmetrical in itself and symmetrical with respect to the beings that would limit it would be neutral and without properties. Properties are not substantial, but relational. They only exist through the interruption of a becoming. So in other words, outer reality or the milieu could be understood in this light as the common symbolic representation of the possibility space of alternate states of being undergoing undergoing individuation. And so this milieu can only emerge once there's a relationship, otherwise this possibility space collapses on itself, as a single individual in a void would have neutral properties. Now it's difficult to try to imagine what the very first symmetry was. I would say that perhaps it was something to do with inner geometry and trying to find a geometric asymmetry within self. But to understand this idea, the intuitive example is imagining a single human on Earth. Like, what would be his properties? Would he be tall? Would he have long hair? Would he be a fast runner? And you understand that all of these properties are only emergent via contrast in comparison to other humans, which means that if there are no other humans around, you can think of that human as having all properties collapsed on itself like a Schrodinger's cat. Basically, his hair is at the same time long and short, he's at the same time a fast and a slow runner, and all of it collapses on itself. And this, links back to yesterday's presentation where Tom Ferosa was discussing the importance of relations, and we also had other presentations that were discussing this. Thus, when we think of cellular division, like mitosis, if interpreted by the considerations above, it isn't reproduction, but a symmetry breaking mechanism. So to give a simple metaphor, if a cell has an equal chance of going left and right, 50-50, then it will make both choices in order to sort of break the perfect symmetry within itself. Via relational asymmetries, which results in the creation of spatial representation of asymmetric relations thus created. So if I occupy this space, you cannot occupy the space that I'm occupying right now, right? So in essence, in this room, we each represent for each other both in a potential increase in the potential inner states that we can have. Like, for instance, you don't know what I'll do in the next instant. I can come walk up to you, shake your hand, or pull your hair. You don't know. But at the same time, a decrease or limitation of alternate inner states of being, because you can't stand where I'm standing and I can sit where you're sitting and vice versa, right? And also what we each believe or perceive about each other influences our inner states and vice versa. So for instance, if you're in a room with 100 people, everybody's listening to you and you tell a joke and nobody laughs, it's almost like you're invalidated in feeling the inner state of being funny, right? It will be very hard for you to convince yourself that you're funny when nobody's laughing, right? So it's almost like each of us is validating or invalidating the right for each of us to have or experience certain inner states of being. And so then, like space basically is a very intuitive kind of interface for mapping the distribution of alternate inner states that are available. So what appears closer to you are alternate inner states that are more likely. What appears far are less likely inner states of being. And then time is basically the modulation between you looking at the available states that are available to you and modulating your inner state in a way to reach a certain finality, which is like sitting on a chair or whatever. So now you may wonder how life could pre-exist the sun or all kinds of conditions which we consider necessary for life's emergence. But from this ontology, the milieu co-evolves alongside individuating beings. And so the milieu is kind of molded in order to structure and facilitate state transitions, which become more determined through the evolution of inner structuring of the network of individuating beings. In other words, without the sun generating sunlight, a plant wouldn't know if its inner structuring, which enables it to carry out photosynthesis, should be in one state or in another state. It wouldn't know if it's supposed to live or die, right? So this might seem a bit weird, but to give another example, imagine if all living creatures had a switch inside of them that could be either on or off. And they collectively agree on creating a symbolic representation of that switch outside of themselves in order to give themselves an objective reason to shift between those two states. They might end up believing that the switch exists outside of themselves as an objective reality, but it's co-emergent to their inner structuring. Those two are mirrored to each other. Maybe I'll skip this one because we might not have the time. But Donald Hoffman, very interesting interface theory of perception. So from all these considerations, one could reverse the problem of emergence, whereby matter, as we see on the outside, is virtual and is a representation of alternate states of being that are available to a network of individuating beings arranged by likelihood. One form of symmetry remains, however. It is the relationship of the inner to outer reality and was best formulated by Simondon as such. One might then assume that the external richness of the relationship to the environment equals the internal richness of the organization contained within an individual. Internal integration is made possible by the quantum nature of the relationship between the environments, external and internal, and the individual as a defined structure. So in other words, if it cannot be experienced within, it cannot be experienced without, and vice versa. Any outer event has to kind of map itself or correspond to an inner experience. Otherwise, it cannot be perceived or it cannot be experienced. Thus, the limits of what is possible on the outside depends on the affordances available on the inside, or more specifically, by the complex relationship and network between intertwined individuating beings through an outer symbolic interface. Now, to give an example, it was thought impossible to run the 100 meters dash faster than 10 seconds. Somebody did it on the side, convincing himself that it was possible. And the moment everybody saw it, everybody says, okay. And then, many other people broke the record subsequently. So, So now, the current model that I'm exploring then looks like a dissociated consciousness will sort of converge on life as a structure in order to experience its own essence of dissociation, and the intermediary structures that we consider as molecules, atoms, quarks, and so on, emerge from an attempt at escaping symmetry until this dissociated consciousness finds a kind of form or structure which creates the required asymmetry via interactions between self-similar entities and a structure which has an inner and outer boundary reflecting its dissociated nature. So in theological and mystical metaphors, you can find traces of a similar kind of insight, as in the Bible, Genesis 1:2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now here the Spirit of God is a proxy for dissociated consciousness that wants to attach itself to something, right? To experience its dissociated nature, and the waters represent the core structure enabling life, or the creation of an inner-outer boundary with a structure which has asymmetrical properties, which is a liquid. The mystical Sufi poet, Rumi, wrote, "You're not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop." And finally, the Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus, who famously stated that the universe is made of water or is liquid. Now, how to make sense of this? Via the model that I'm exploring, the story of the genesis of the universe goes something like this. A dissociated consciousness tries to experience its dissociated state and creates more and more sophisticated geometric patterns within itself in an attempt to escape perfect symmetry, which creates the experience of dissociation. It settles on the liquid form because it's the perfect geometric shape to experience asymmetry. If it's too solid, then it's too symmetrical. If it's too vaporous, then it's too chaotic, and you cannot experience the gradual transitions between states. Then you create copies of yourself every time you experience inner symmetry, and this populates reality with a network of self-contained living liquid droplets, if you will, that entertain a certain relationship to one another. And the ocean, then, is kind of co-emergent with as these sort of entities grow, right? So the ocean can be thought of as the mediating interface representing how they should shift their inner states in respect to one another. The more such beings divide, the more the ocean grew in complexity, like a self-contained virtual probability cloud representing the future potential alternate states that all individuating beings could take at a certain point in the evolution of their network. And gradually, through the interaction between these beings, the geometric patterns within them took the form of atoms or quarks, which are virtual appearances of the network's rules for modulating their inner geometry in specific ways, emergent from their relationship to one another. In other words, it's as if the collectively generated probability cloud emergent from the inner states that are possible for these self-contained droplets was then molded in order to access more and more defined inner states, which means essentially manifesting more sophisticated forms, which we could identify as like unicellular organisms, and then the evolution of life, basically. But what this also means is that the past and future evolve simultaneously to the network of all individuating beings. Now, you could represent it metaphorically as the growth of a tree, whereby the present moment is like a slice of the trunk growing horizontally as more and more cells are added to the trunk, which represents the complexification of the present experienced moment and the network of individuating beings in that slice. And simultaneously growing vertically in time, the past becomes more complex as the roots grow longer in order to reflect the complexity of the current network at the cross-section of that trunk. And then simultaneously, the leaves and branches sort of represent the increase in the potential futures that can be experienced from that slice. To give another example, it would be weird if the new pre-individual infinite potential contained within infinity would experience itself in a nice linear fashion, like counting from 1 to infinity, right? Rather, the experience itself would be a process that would be simultaneous and can best be viewed as the focus effect on a camera, where the entire scene comes into focus and becomes sharper simultaneously. And in this model, the focusing effect is linked to the multiplication and complexification of individuating beings present at any point, which means the more we are as humans in this reality, the more complex and sophisticated and granular and sharper this reality becomes because of the states that we unlock via the interactions with each other. And so reality becomes more complex as our network becomes more complex. So the history of the milieu reflects the current state of relations of entities in the milieu. What this also means is that the emergence, for instance, of solid matter is conditional upon the existence of a solid state within the network of individuating beings. So you first have to create a solid structure within you in order for outer reality to evolve and take the appearance of rocks or whatever, or continents, which represent a structured and symbolic representation of the potential states that your inner solid matter could be in. Without the outer symbolic representation, you wouldn't know which state the solid structure that you harbor within should be in. Simondon ascribes very special qualities to life and the individual, namely the mediation between the micro and the macro, as I was saying, sitting kind of in the middle of those two dimensions. And now, to quote Simondon, the initiation of the genesis of substance does not belong either to brute matter as passive, nor to form as pure. Rather, it is the complete system that generates, and it does so because it is a system of actualizing potential energy, actively mediating between two realities of different orders of magnitude into an intermediate order. And indeed, if you look at the cosmological scale, unicellular life is pretty much smack in the middle between the Hubble kind of universal and the Planck scale. And so since outer reality and inner reality are a mirror of each other, once the nexus of individuating beings reaches a certain threshold, the number of alternate states of being available to them due to the potential interactions between them becomes too complex to be mapped onto any individual. And so the formation of a planet is like a self-enclosed milieu or outer perceived environment, depends upon the informational limit of any individuating being of mapping the state of this virtual outer reality into an inner experience, which consolidates the network into a self-enclosed system incapable of going further due to informational saturation. So one could think of Indra's net to understand this phenomenon. So Indra's net is an ancient metaphor from Buddhism and Hindu philosophy illustrating the interconnectedness and interdependence of all phenomena in this universe. Imagine a vast infinite net stretching in every direction with a jewel positioned at the center, like a perfectly reflective sphere. And at each intersection, each jewel perfectly reflects all the others, creating an infinite interplay of reflections. In this metaphor, jewels represent the individuating beings, like living cells, or life, and the reflection that shows up on each of these beings' surface, taken together, represents an instantaneous kind of snapshot of the appearance of outer reality. But now imagine that each of these jewels has a maximum resolution, like pixel density on a screen, right? If you add just one more jewel, then the surface on all of those jewels can no longer reflect on its surface the totality of the reflections of all of the jewels. So what happens then? And this is a potential solution to the combination problem, or why there is combination in the first place. When outer reality becomes too complex, combination is the only solution, as it creates a new coherent whole made up of different parts, which can map or reflect a more complex reality by coherently diffusing information through a bigger structure. Now, the basic example, if I slap this table, there's a bunch of unicellular creatures there, and they experience that as a unique biochemical event that is unrelated to another. They cannot understand that this was an action made by a single being with a single hand, right? They see it as independent events. And also unicellular organisms a little farther away from my hand, they have no idea what happened, right? Whereas if I slap a person, then that information propagates through the cellular network as one coherent global event, right? So Simondon himself talks about this kind of layering of inner-outer realities, like the fact that your body's inner reality is an outer reality from the perspective of your organs, and your organs is an external reality from the perspective of your cells. And this means that as humans, made up of all these various parts, we've inherited at least two main interfaces. The geosphere, which is like consolidated by the network of unicellular organisms, which is their interface for mapping how they should kind of change their inner states. And then the biosphere, which is consolidated by the pluricellular organisms, on top of which arguably humans add up ideas, or in Teilhard de Chardin's vocabulary, the noosphere. So this room is full of geosphere-based elements, like the metal on these chairs, and biosphere elements, which is like the wood of these chairs. And then these elements are going to be molded into ideas through humans. So in other words, you can consider the human as the singularity or seed, which enables the transduction or individuation, gradual individuation of the noosphere. Now, how does this model change how we view causality? In science, causality is traditionally understood in two contrasting ways. There's like descending causality, which implies that there's like some external event that sort of maps itself gradually on all the different layers that you contain, like, the ball hits you, and then your cells adapt, and then the molecules in those cells adapt, etc., and that trickles down into all of your different layers. Or an ascending model whereby you have this quantum foam, and then you have gradual decoherence, and you have particles appearing, and then it becomes more and more classical in its behavior until it becomes a cell, right? But in this kind of ontology, the model I explore implies a synchronization or a mirroring of these two causalities, which are simultaneous, and whereby events from the outer perceived reality converge towards the present moment, which can be thought of as the barrier of the skin, while simultaneously ascending through the inner structures of your body. And so they meet in the middle, where it's the present moment, and those two processes are actually a mirror of each other. So the space around me, for instance, represents potential future alternate states for my bodily cells, and I can navigate towards collapsing a certain defined state from the quantum possibilities that reside within, represented through outer reality. So now, according to this model, if you were to answer questions like whether free will exists, then the short answer would be you're looking at it, basically. A common critique of panpsychism is to ask what it's like to be a rock, but if outer reality is based on the alternate potential future states that are available to you, then then you could answer that if you were a rock, you would perceive reality as a tunnel where you would look at all of your future states neatly ordered and you'd be falling inexorably into that tunnel. So if there were no free will, our perceived reality would collapse into a tunnel. And some of you might suggest that this just might be the case, but the cross-section of this tunnel is wide enough to accommodate for relative free will, which I would agree with. The more interesting question is what it's like to be a kidney stone inside your body. Because whenever you move your body, the state of your kidney stone is affected. And so while inside your body, your kidney stone will inherit your own degrees of freedom, as you can't predict the future state of the kidney stone in the next 10 seconds. Now imagine if your kidney stone is creating high degrees of pain inside your kidneys. Now your kidney stones becomes a crucial factor determining how you will act in the world, right? Or your future choices. Now these are all fun, thought experiments, but it still raises the question of where you draw the line between conscious and unconscious. But this distinction is kind of moot since inner and outer reality in this ontology are just a mirror of each other. They're a symbolic representation of each other. So consciousness is everywhere, but it doesn't mean that the table has an inner experience. The inner experience of the table is my experience of the table. We are one and the same, you see? Like every time that I feel something bumping into the table corresponds to inner state, and that inner state is equivalent to what the table's feeling as well, kind of. So I'm almost done. If it cannot exist within, it cannot be perceived or experienced without. And this brings to me like the danger of self-fulfilling prophecies through the suppression of inner states reverberating outward. So it's ontological assumptions about reality which lock you into a certain number of inner states that are now available to you and others are not, right? And so the thought experiment is the scientists and the mystic cells inside the body. So imagine a bunch of scientifically minded cells in your body and a bunch of mystic cells in your body that are having a debate. And the scientist cells in your body say, hey, I understand everything about this environment. It's all just biochemical reactions, cause and effect, and here are the laws, there's nothing transcendental. And then the mystic cells say, well, I don't know. I think we're part of a global whole that has its own life, its own intelligence, its own agency, and there's these synchronicities that happen in the body. And the question is, which one of these cells is correct, right? And my take is they're both right, which is if the scientists manage to convince every single other cell that that's how the body behaves, then the body decomposes and they'll be saying, well, you see, we were right. This is only biochemistry. And if the mystics convince all the other cells that they are in sort of a coherent whole and start behaving according to that belief, they'll also have proof of what they believe, right? And so here it's about understanding that our choice of ontology influences our experience of the world, and that there are no fixed laws there that are given to us and we have no choice, right? It's about rekindling with this kind of power of choice, I guess. What kind of things does this model predict? Well, maybe are we reaching a point where the combination of alternate inner states of being unlocked by the growing human network is too complex for an individual human to map or reflect, which would mean this whole GAIA hypothesis, like the Earth becoming a conscious, self-aware being. But again, understand, like the moment that external reality becomes too complex for humans to manage is because we've unlocked that complexity via the interaction with each other, via the asymmetry in the noosphere that we create by that interaction, which means that you have to create a kind of a coherent whole or coherent structure to navigate through that complexity. So looking at recent developments in AI, robots, blockchain, decentralized autonomous organizations, smart contracts, we could view all of these as the potential manifestations of stabilizing homeostatic functions for human-designed systems, stabilizing the human network of individuated beings, which might eventually lead to the emergence of a kind of a planetary consciousness or a planet considering that all that is within is its body and cells. Future work, well, first I need to finish my PhD thesis, but what is consciousness? I put that for good measure. I think probably have to put it on every slide. Then there's other things you could examine, like the ontology of the pre-individual state, the origin of dissociation, compatibility with this kind of ontology with observation, especially with epistemological frameworks, whether they're suitable to test this hypothesis. Parallels between Simondon, Whitehead, and there are plenty of different philosophers that had kind of a similar intuition of the relational emergence of reality. And then further explore the implications of this model on epistemology and ontology. Thank you very much.
much for this talk. So now we have some time for questions. Yeah, we've got one in front.
Thank you very much. I found it very interesting to see that there seem to be parallels or associations between your approach relying on Simondon and Herbert Witzmann's structure phenomenology with which I'm working, and seems to be a very similar structure of a you talk about a pre-individual state of unstructured potential, which is broken up and then reconstituted in a certain way. And I recommend you to take a look into structure phenomenology. However, I think there could be a difference between the two approaches in terms of experiential accessibility. So I would like to ask you if you think that your approach provides some more concrete experiences of these structures you have presented, especially in terms of the process. And my question would be, are there only states of pre-individual and individualized beings like us with consciousness or without consciousness? Or is it also possible to describe experiences of human beings or other beings which would constitute the shift, the change, the reconstitution from a decomposed state to a reconstituted state? What would you say?
So I'm not sure I understood everything because I remember I'm kind of new to this. But I would view that there are two distinct phases. There's one where there's a kind of unconscious phase of this dissociated consciousness trying to zero in on a structure that enables for it to experience something, which is the way it unconsciously sort of structures itself within these geometric patterns to break up symmetry. And then once it's conscious, it inherits all these structures which it has to unravel, then consciously. You see? So it's as if you were locking yourself up into a very sophisticated dream in order to have the illusion of being, someone kind of concrete like you and me. And then you have to wake up to all of the structuring that you made to descend into that dream to sort of wake up to your true sort of self. And that's the two-way process, basically. And so you have, almost like Genesis, it said like creation was instantaneous. It looks like that way. But I think like the structuring of the limitations you imposed yourself upon yourself are almost instantaneous, which means the geometric patterns which break perfect symmetry. And then the unraveling is very long because you have to explore all the possibility space of all the molecules in your cells. Then all the possibility space of all the atoms within your cells. And then all of the possibility space that emerges from all the quarks in your cells. And you do that through structures which are more and more complex that can manage that degree of potentiality within these structures. You understand? I hope that makes sense.
And is this an experience to structure molecules? It's not my experience to structure my molecules.
I think you're doing it right now. But maybe you're doing it homeostatically, but what you're doing as a human, our experience is structuring ideas. That's our experience, right? Because within us, the structuring of cells has been reverse engineered, if you will, and represents you as a talking, walking human that doesn't die instantly because your cells devour each other, basically. But then our challenge is, sort of exploring the noospheric potential, which kind of mirrors the potential in the molecules, if you will. Like the cells ordering into pluricellular organisms unravel the potential that is contained within biology, which cements through the different animals and creatures, whatever. And then humans, through the noosphere and mastery over ideas, then can explore the whole potential that resides in the potential space of chemicals or chemical molecular arrangements, see? Which would be impossible to navigate through if you weren't a human and you didn't have ideas about the world and ontology and all these things. Because it's just too wide, it's just too big for biology to explore without the noosphere as a kind of way to manipulate itself. Understand?
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay.
There's another question here.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Thomas Simondon. I just have two short questions regarding the relationship between individual and milieu. So the first one, why consider this relation as exclusively connected with life? So I mean, you said it's not really connected with physics, but I mean, it really depends on what kinds of physics they endorse here. Like if you endorse like Bohmian mechanics, they will say, well, you can only talk about as particle connected with this environment. So it seems that in this case, if you endorse this kind of physics, then we can also talk about environment, milieu, and individual in physics. So this is the first question. And second, well, let's say, okay, I agree that this milieu-individual relationship is related to life. But then, why should we consider this relationship as symbolic? I mean, like scientists, biologists, they would say, okay, at best we have teleology, but from teleology to symbolic, this is still a very long way to go. So why consider it as symbolic?
Right. So the first question is, for Simondon, the relationship between individual and milieu co-emerging and especially co-individuating, which means informing each other, there is a kind of feedback loop there. But any other structure besides life doesn't have that potential. Like an atom is not going to, out of its own volition, modify the milieu, which in turn will modify the atom. They're going to almost equalize. You know, there isn't this dynamic process of co-shaping each other mutually. And for the symbolic, I think that it's related to Donald Hoffman's slide that I actually skipped, which is we create the way that we perceive reality is for practical purposes. Basically, where is it? Here it is. Yeah. But so. The way we perceive reality is for practical purposes because it's too complex in order to be understood as it is. Like if I were having to see reality represented as all the biochemical changes that would happen in my body if I sit on this chair, I wouldn't see this chair as it is, and it would be just too complex for me to understand. And I wouldn't even see the relation between this chair and another chair because those two biochemical states would be completely different. Or even, arguing, saying like, objectively in this room, there's only photons, protons, and protons, neutrons, and electrons. And if I were to see that as a reality, then this would be static. And the oxygen between you and me would mean that this reality would just make no sense, right? And so the symbolic element is there for simplifying the complexity of the emergence of the assemblage between all of these different parts that each have their own symbolic representation of reality as well. See, so it's there as a simplification mechanism, and it's linked to the interface theory of perception of Donald Hoffman.